OpenAI recently launched the Custom GPT marketplace. I went to the marketplace and I took a look at all the custom GPTs that people have built and launched. And to be honest, it was pretty underwhelming. Most of the custom GPTs were some enhanced prompts that people had created, and all I was getting was some text. But there were a couple of them that I really liked. One of them was, for example, Canva. The other one was All Trails. And both of them had something in common. Both of them leverage something known as actions. And actions in custom GPT are essentially these API calls or these commands that GPT can perform on your behalf and get some custom data from your own tech stack. So just to give you an example, I asked ChatGPT what's on my to-do list, but it has no idea. It's like, I don't have access to your personal documents or data, including your to-do list, right? So it's of no use. Had it known what's on my to-do list, then I can do all sorts of things with it. I can ask it like how many tasks I have, how should I work on them, give me some ideas. But without that data, we are pretty much stuck. It's like, it's pretty much lost, and it cannot tell me anything about my to-do list, and let alone any creative ideas built on top of my to-do list. Okay, so then how do we fix it? How do we allow or configure rather ChatGPT to be able to connect with our to-do list or any other application for that matter? How do we make that happen? And for that, of course, if you haven't guessed it already, we need to build a custom GPT that has the capability to talk to the application of our choice. So before we build that, let me flip over to the Miro board here so we can just draw out the architecture so that it all makes sense before we get to the build part. So let me just pick some shapes from here to represent all the components of this architecture. So the first one obviously is our custom GPT. So this is where all the interaction is going to happen. This is where let me just put a user here. There we go. And this is where basically we are interacting. All the interaction is happening here, just like we talked to ChatGPT, no difference, just that we are going to be interacting with the custom GPT. And then on the other side of the spectrum is our application. And this can be any application, right? So this can be your to-do list application. This can be your calendar. This can be anything you want custom GPT to be able to talk to and fetch data from. So in our case, in my case, what I want to do is I want to connect to my to-do list, which happens to be in Notion. So we'll have to somehow figure out a connection between custom GPT and Notion. And how do we do that? We'll get to that in a second. But remember that this can be any application. And you can follow the same steps once you know how to build this. And I'll just put that note here just so there's no confusion. Perfect. Okay, so now custom GPT requires, and how do we make the connection? We'll get to that in a second. But before that, custom GPT has 3 requirements. So let's just list those out here. So the first one, increase the font size requirements. The first one is it needs a name. So easy, we can give it any name. Second one is it needs a set of instructions. So think of instructions as essentially an enhanced version of a prompt. So when you talk to ChatGPT, you give it some prompts and then it acts accordingly. And in a custom GPT, think of it as a static prompt that always lives there. So whenever custom GPT is performing actions on your behalf, it always keeps those instructions in mind. And essentially that prompt is always used for every action that you do. And then third one is something called actions. And let me fix the formatting here a little bit and bold these 3 requirements. And I'm also going to make this left aligned so it's easier to consume. There we go. Perfect. So actions, let's talk about these, right? So actions is where custom GPTs become really interesting. This is that missing piece that allows us to interact with data sitting in a different application. Because with just the instructions, all you have is a prompt. So this is similar to what happened here. Imagine my prompt was what's on my to-do list. It can't do much. It can only respond to the prompt, and that's pretty much it. It doesn't have access to any other data, so it's lost. But once you introduce the actions, now all of a sudden the game changes. So actions are these custom commands or API calls that the GPT can perform on your behalf to talk to other applications that you use and get the data from them. So this is where things get interesting. And all of a sudden we have this almost unlimited ability to get data within the GPT and use that data for the prompts or within the prompts to do all sorts of different things. But how do they work? You need to, just like instructions are provided in text, for actions, you need to provide something known as an API spec. And this is nothing more than, if you don't know what's an API spec, it's nothing more than a formal definition of what calls are being made from here to here and what data is being sent with these calls, right? So it's going to be making some API calls. And so the API spec is a way to tell the GPT how to make these API calls, right? What API calls to make, what data to send, what data to expect, all sorts of things. It's described in the specification so that when the GPT is about to make a call, it will look at those specifications and then formulate the API call accordingly. So API spec is how we define those things. And in our case, what's going to happen is, let me just create some space here. In our case, basically, there will be two parts of the API spec. So let me just copy this here. And so in the spec, we will have two things. Number one will be a definition to get the to-do list. So we'll have get part of the API spec, get to-dos. And we'll have another part of the API spec, which will be to create new to-dos. So these are two different types of calls or two different types of actions that GPT will have to make based on what we have asked it to do. And this is something we are going to define in the API spec. And when it comes time to make the call, GPT will be aware of how to make this particular API call to perform the action of our choice. Very good. Okay. So we can do that, but now you might be wondering, for this, we need to work with the Notion API, and we need to figure out how to add something to the Notion database or get something from the Notion database, which sounds a little cumbersome, and it is. So we are not going to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is we are going to use something in the middle that makes this setup a bit easier. And let me delete this connection. So we will not be talking to Notion directly. Instead, what we're going to do is we are going to add something in the middle here. And today we are going to use a tool called Make, which used to be called Integromat. If you don't know what it is, I have a separate video on getting started with Make. But essentially, it's an automation tool that connects with thousands of different applications and already has an integration with Notion and many other to-do applications, which makes it really easy to perform these two tasks that we want to perform today. So in our setup, Make is going to talk to Notion and do the heavy lifting, which is getting to-dos and creating to-dos. So let's just put that here. So Make will take care of that part. And then all we have to do now is connect Custom GPT to Make, right? And then for this, we're going to use something called a Webhook. And this will all make sense when we get to the build part. So the Webhook essentially exposes a URL that we will provide in our API spec that the Custom GPT will call. Custom GPT has no idea what's happening, where the data is coming from. All it's going to do is make this call, which will then go to Make. Make will call Notion or any other application, as I mentioned, get the data back, and then send the Webhook response back to the GPT. And that's how the Custom GPT will know what's on my to-do list. Okay, so that's the setup. And now it's time to build. All right, so let's switch over to ChatGPT. And to create a custom GPT, I believe you need to have the paid version of ChatGPT. But if you have it, then what you do is you go to chat.openai.com/create, which is going to bring you to this editor where you configure everything that we just talked about. So we click on configure, and then first things first, we are going to give the custom GPT a name, and then we are going to give it a description of what this GPT is all about. We are going to give the instructions, which again go in text format. And then finally, we are going to create new actions, which is how it will connect to Make and then to Notion. So let's go one step at a time. So first thing is to give it a name, and I'm going to call it Tasks GPT. Very good. And then we are going to give it a description. So we'll say your custom GPT to create new tasks and fetch tasks from the to-do list. And it's funny how I keep switching between tasks and to-dos. So I'm just going to mention both. To-do list, also known as Task Manager in Notion. Very good. So that's the description. And then the next thing it asks is, what are the instructions? Like, how does it behave, what it should do, what it should avoid. And what I've done is I've already created within this page some instructions. And essentially, I have two parts of the instructions. One is for the create to-dos part, and one is for the get to-dos part. And for the create to-dos part, it's very simple. It says, if not provided, ask for a description, priority, and the due date of the task. And once all the necessary data has been collected, create the task using the configured action. So it will ask you, hey, what's the description of the task? Does it have a due date? Does it have a priority and stuff like that? And once it thinks all the data has been collected, it will call the action that we will configure in a second to create new tasks. And those tasks will then end up in my task DB within Notion. Okay. Similarly, I have a instruction for the get to do part, which is, it says the task is to generate a user-friendly task table. Similar to how we have a table here, we want Custom GPT to create that similar table within the GPT interface, within the chat interface. And then I have some associated requirements listed here. For example, come up with a completion time for the task, suggest some actions for the task. So these are things that GPT is going to do on top of the data that comes back from Notion. And that's why we want to do this integration in the first place, so that we can be creative with the data that we have at hand. Because if I just wanted to check the task, I can just go here, but I want to be able to chat with ChatGPT and use it for creative purposes. And then I also have a note, the table should be clear, so on and so forth, and all that good stuff. You can write out these instructions. You can list any things that it should do and it should not do. And then once you have them, you can basically just copy it or type it directly in the GPT and paste it here. There we go. And the next thing it asks is, do you have any conversation starters? So if there's any actions that you are going to be performing on a pretty regular basis, you can list them out here. So I'll add two of them. So one of them will be what's on my to-do list. And the second one will be add a new due to my list. So these two will then appear here as shortcuts so that I don't even have to type them. They become the conversation starters, right? And then finally, it is time to configure the actions. But before we do that, let's see what it does. So let's click on what's on my to-do list. And I'm pretty much expecting the same response as before, which is, I have no idea. I did a quick search. I am unable to access your personal to-do list, blah, 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 all that stuff. It was expected because we haven't configured the action. So I'm just going to stop it. Okay. So now let's configure the actions. But before we configure the actions, let's take a quick detour and understand the setup that I have in Make and how these webhook calls are going to work. So let me switch over to Make. So here I have a setup called Custom GPT. And essentially what it's doing is, just like I explained in the diagram here, GPT is going to call Make, and Make is going to call Notion to either get a to-do or create a to-do. So let me come back here. So we're going to leverage the same webhook. It's the same webhook that ChatGPT is going to be calling, but it has for the two different cases, it has a critical difference. And that is the type of the call or the type of the method that GPT is going to use to call this webhook. So let me go back here. In the get case, it is going to be a get call, which is an HTTP standard method. And in the create case, it is going to be using a method called post. So whenever you call a webhook or an API with post as the method, it is supposed to perform an action, which is add something new to your list. And when you use get as the method, it is supposed to get something from your existing data, right? And this is how Make will be able to differentiate between whether it is supposed to get the to-dos or create a to-do. So as you can see here, I have a filter set up. Here it says, if the method is get, then it is going to search in my Notion, get my task, and then send them back in this webhook response. Otherwise, it will go to this route and it will create a new item provided by ChatGPT and then send a response that, hey, I just created your task, you're good to go. So this is the setup in Make. And as I said, I have a different video on Make, on getting started with Make. So if this doesn't make sense, feel free to watch that one and it will become pretty clear as to how this thing can be set up for any application of your choice. Okay, so we have this setup, and then we are expecting that there are two types of calls, one to get and one to post. So before we add them to our actions here, let's quickly go to Postman. And I just want to show you how these calls work and what exactly is happening. So I'm going to flip over to Postman, and I've already set up these calls here. So you can see the get call and the post call. So let's start with get. And it's basically just my webhook URL. And optionally, I can also give it a count in the query parameter, which determines how many tasks it is going to fetch from Notion. So let me just give, like, for example, 2 tasks, count is 2, and then hit send. So it was able to fetch, as you can see, 2 tasks from Notion, 1 and 2. If I collapse this, you can, well, it's not showing the number today, but usually it is able to show how many objects are there in the array. But yeah, so you can see these are 2 tasks that came back from Notion. If I gave it something like, if I change the number to 5, it will fetch 5 tasks from Notion. And all of this is configured in Make. So if I go here, if I look at search, it has the count variable, which comes from the webhook, and it can tell Notion, hey, this is the number of tasks I'm looking for. So that's the get call. But we can also do the post call. So in the post call, again, same webhook, but we need to send some data with it. And one of the things we need to send with it is the description of the task. So here I'll say, this is a task for the demo video. There we go. So now if I hit send, and notice this is a post call, so Make will know that it's a post call, and it will go into this part of the route, and it will create a new item. So let's click on send. And there we go. So it says created true, and it gave me a link to my Notion database. And if we go here, we can see the task. It says this is a test task for the demo video. So it was created through this API call, which went to Make, decided it needs to go here, created the task, and then sent the response back. So all of this is working even outside of ChatGPT. Now we just need to fill this gap. So far what I showed you was this part of the setup. And now we need to create this part of the setup, and then everything will work end to end. Very good. I won't go into the details of how to create the API spec, but here are some examples that you can look at. For example, if you click on weather, it will give you how to set up your API spec. Essentially what it contains is, it contains a URL, and this is where I will put my webhook URL, and then it has different paths that you can call. In our case, it's just going to be the index, and we will have 2 types of calls, a get call and a post call, right? So let's get rid of this, and I already have a spec here ready to go. And what I'll do is I'll take my URL out and leave the spec in the comments below so that you can enter your own webhook URL and do something similar. Let me go back here and paste it. And as you can see, I have the webhook URL, and then I have a get call, which is retrieves a list of to-dos. And I also have a post call, which creates a new to-do. And it also contains, the spec also contains what kind of data it is supposed to send in the body. I won't go into too much details about the API spec. That's for a separate video, but you can feel free to use this one that I've created. And now, if you scroll down, you will notice that it knows that there are 2 actions that it can take, the get action and the post action. And it says get to do and add to do. So now it seems to be aware of how to get this data. And if we go back to our GPT and try this again, now hopefully it is going to be able to make the call and get our tasks from Notion. So let's click on this button again. What's on my to-do list? There we go. So now it says the GPT wants to talk to Make, and I will say always allow. And it is going to call, Make will call Notion, and then it's going to respond with some tasks and follow my instructions of providing my tasks in a table. There we go. It even got the task that we just created from Postman. And notice that it is creating a table because that's what I put in my instructions. I always wanted to give me the tasks in a table format. And so these 4 parts of the task came from Notion, but then it did its magic. ChatGPT did its thing and also created estimated completion time and suggested how to get started with these tasks. And you can do all sorts of things once you have the data. So now it's still going. Please note, blah, blah, blah. I can stop it. And now it has access to the data. We can do all sorts of things with it. So I can ask it like, are there any shopping related tasks? And let's see what it says. So now it's thinking, it's looking at my data. Now it's aware of my to-do list. It's no longer disconnected. So it says, among your tasks, there's one that involves shopping, order office supplies. And indeed, there is one that's called order office supplies. And it is even able to tell me what's the due date. And it says the priority is marked as low. Now, all of a sudden, I'm able to chat with my to-do list application. So that was how to get my task. So now let's also try if we can create a new task. Add a new task on my list. And I'll say something like, buy more coffee. And let's see what we get. Starting action. It says it wants to talk to Meg, so I'll confirm. There we go. So it says task buy more coffee has been successfully added. So let's go to Notion and see if it was indeed added. And there we go. Buy more coffee was added. So I'm going to ask it. Let's see if it's intelligent enough. Can you share the link to the latest task you created? And look at that. It says certainly you can find the task buy more coffee at this link. And let's try to click on that. And there we go. So it did remember, because that's how I configured Make. It should be sending the URL back. So ChatGPT is aware of this data. And even if we look at the response, you will see that the URL was indeed sent back. So when I asked for it, it was able to point me to the right place. So there we go. So now we are able to both add new tasks as well as fetch tasks. And of course, what we have to do is save it. And since this contains my private webhook URL, I'm not going to share it with everyone. Otherwise, I will totally get spammed. I'll only keep it to me and confirm. And there are ways to make it available to everyone, which is for another video again. But for this one, I wanted to give you an idea of how to create a custom GPT in a way where it is more interactive with your applications and has access to all the data that you need. Okay, so it just finished saving. And notice what happened in my chat GPT. So it brought me over to my chat GPT. And now all of a sudden I see Task GPT as one of the options. Just I mentioned Canva towards the beginning of the video. Now Task GPT is one of the custom GPTs available to me within my chat interface. And it's the same GPT that we just built. And I can come here. So let's say I'm doing my work, whatever. I have a new chat going, but all of a sudden I want to know, hey, what's on my list? So same thing. I can say, hey, give me the high priority tasks for today. So then it should be able to make the call and get the task. Just a note, I did not configure it to be smart enough to know it has to add a date to the call, but that's definitely possible as well. There we go. And it's going to keep going. But essentially now I can, within my chat, talk to Task GPT, which I built, and get my data from my to-do list within Notion. That's pretty much it for today. I hope this was helpful. And as I said, I will leave the link to the instructions as well as the API spec down below. And feel free to take it for a spin. And don't forget to check out the video on Make as well if you want to understand more about how to set up this middle piece for custom GPTs. But with this knowledge, you are now looking at endless possibilities with custom GPTs. So I hope you have fun with it and build something interesting. And I will see you next time.